Hey everybody, welcome to this video. My name is Amanda. I am a hand embroidery artist and I run this channel to help people get creative and learn the art of embroidery. In this video, I wanted to go over how to use a popular embroidery transfer method, which is stick and stitch. I have the sheets right here. They come in printable sheets that fit in your printer, and they're really convenient for transferring highly detailed designs and for transferring stuff on fabric maybe that you can't see through to trace the design with. So I think it's a really helpful option for someone that's working on a piece of clothing, which is what I'm actually doing right now. So I'm using it for this sweater pattern that I'm working on, and this is kind of what sparked my idea of just going ahead and embroidering this and stitching with you and just kind of walking you through how you can use it and some tips and tricks, because there are some downsides to using it. Nothing that's a deal breaker, but it can be a little bit tricky to use sometimes. I'm hoping in this video that it will help you to prevent some problems that people run into, and you'll be able to use it and it'll be enjoyable for you. So let's get into it. Stick and stitch comes in packs like this that are printable. You can fit them directly in your printer. The material is basically a water-soluble sheet of paper, and it has kind of a fabric-like texture. You can print directly on it, and then when you're finished, it dissolves in water. You can use this transfer method for pretty much anything you want, but there are a few that it's exceptionally helpful for. If you are stitching on a darker fabric, I think that the stabilizer, it's more opaque, so if you print out something with like a black outline, I think it's easier to see. The other thing that's really nice is that it can be used for things like clothing. You can easily stick the adhesive onto a piece of clothing and have it secure in the area that you want to stitch. So that's a great option. Another option would be if you're using a material that's a little bit harder to draw on, like felt or maybe knitwear, like this project I'm working on here. The fabric may be too thick, or it might just not be the right texture to draw on with like carbon, pencil, or water-soluble pen. So I think that this is a great option for a lot of different projects. An added benefit to it is it also provides a slight amount of stabilization to the fabric. So if you're using a piece of fabric that's a little bit thinner, it might help to keep it from puckering and wrinkling. So here's how you can directly print on the sheets of stick and stitch. You'll just need a standard printer. I like to use an inkjet printer. I have read that laser printers do not work well for this. The carbon that is used in a laser printer can actually stain fabrics. So I would recommend using a regular inkjet printer. That's generally what most people have in their homes. You will just place the sheet of paper face down in your printer, or however the tray usually works to spit out the paper and print on it is how you will place the paper. The textured side is the side that you want to be printed on, so you want to make sure that it's facing the correct way, and then the paper on the back, it will be something that will be trashed once you have printed everything. So you will open up your PDF pattern. That's the best way to print something out, and use a letter or A4 setting on your printer like you usually would for a standard piece of printer paper, and then you can just directly print it out. You can print it at a lower opacity if you're worried about the ink bleeding onto anything, but I actually have a couple of tips at the end of this video that might help you to prevent that from happening, and you can pretty much just go about printing as usual. I will say that I have never tested this out with full color images. I don't know if that would bleed or not, so I would stick to an embroidery design that's just a black outline, one that doesn't have a ton of different color and ink that would have to go onto the paper. Once you have printed out your design, you can go ahead and trim around the design. I like to leave like about a 1/2 inch margin. That way I know that it will hopefully stick around the edges, because sometimes if you cut it too close and your needle gets to the edge, you can kind of pull up the stick and stitch. So I basically just cut it out similar to this, and then you can just peel off the backing of this and you can stick it wherever you want. So once you have placed it onto your garment or piece of fabric that you want to stitch on, you can keep it like that if you feel like it's sticking well enough, or you can also add a loose basting stitch, which is basically just a large running stitch that will help to secure the outside edges of the stick and stitch. And this is something that will be removed in the end, so you don't need to make the stitches super tight or short. I normally make them pretty loose and long, just enough to kind of almost tack down the edge of the stick and stitch. I don't always do this, but I do find that sometimes I do need to do it, especially if I'm working on clothing like this, where I'm having to move the hoop around. Then you are pretty much ready to get stitching, and you should be able to use your usual embroidery needle and your embroidery thread. I don't think that it's super hard to stitch through. The sheets of paper are actually relatively thin, so I've never had issues where it feels like it's too thick. But I will say that it can be a little bit sticky sometimes, especially if you live in a more humid environment. So you may have a little bit of trouble with this, and I do have a few tips for that. So sometimes you will notice when you work with it for a while that with excessive handling, your needle will start to get sticky, and sometimes your hands will kind of start to get a little bit sticky. So I would recommend that you keep a dry paper towel or a cloth on hand that you can kind of dry your hands with and wipe off the needle with. The other thing that I really like to use is a needle sharpener off of one of these little tomato pin cushions. You can run your needle through this little strawberry. It has emery in it, and it's actually a natural needle sharpener. So it helps to wipe off and clean off any of that stickiness, and it also can sharpen your needle back up, because even though it's not super hard to stitch through, I do sometimes notice that my needle will dull a little bit too, and I think it is just from the extra layer, but also from some of the adhesive. So that really helps. I personally do not do this, but I know it does work as well. You can also get like alcohol in a bottle or alcohol swabs and just wipe off the needle from time to time, and that will also help to prevent you from having to deal with that. The other thing is that I have found, and I have heard other people talk about, is that the thread can be a little bit hard to get through if you're using a lot of thread. So I generally, most of my embroidery patterns and designs that I make, I use 1 to 2 strands of cotton floss, and I don't normally have any issues with this. But I have noticed that if you use like 5 or 6 strands, like a thicker strand, it can be a little bit hard to stitch through. So I would say try to minimize the amount of strands you're using if you're using this product. Finally, let's talk about removing the stick and stitch properly and preventing any of the ink from staining your clothes. So the first thing that I recommend is to take warm water and submerge the embroidery fully in that warm water for at least 5 minutes. This will basically soften and dissolve some of the stabilizer, and it will kind of loosen it off of the surface of the fabric. This is really important to do because I've found that if you just run it underwater, you just can't as thoroughly get the stabilizer off, and I do find that I have had instances where the ink will stain the fabric. So I think that submerging and soaking it does a huge difference for this. Next, once you do that, you can take it out of the water, and then you can run it under some running water and gently rub your fingers on the embroidery and try to kind of gently remove any debris that you see. I like to try to be extra careful with this because you can disturb the stitches and pull them out if you're too rough with it, so just be mindful of that while you're doing it. There are some rare instances where I have had a little bit of bleeding onto the fabric from the ink, and usually you can get it out by either putting some alcohol on the clothing or the fabric, or you can soak it in something like OxyClean. I have done that before, and it's worked really well to lift any stains off of it. As always, if you're nervous about something being ruined or stained, I would highly recommend testing out a few stitches on top of some printed stick and stitch in a discrete area before you commit to using it on a large area of something like clothing or a particular fabric you don't want to waste. And you can always do that and err on the side of caution if you feel like you are going to mess something up. And that's pretty much it. I love this stuff. I don't use it for every single project, but I use it quite frequently, and I highly recommend it to anybody that's interested. I have it linked down below. You can find it online in a lot of different places, and you can find some other generic versions sometimes at other craft stores. So let me know if you have any additional tips or tricks that you'd like to share with everybody. Thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.